Chapter 6. Duo settled into the back seat of the car, somewhat heartened by the fact that these military guys hadn't roughed him up even half as much as Oz would have by now. The ride was quiet, with the Major muttering things to the woman driving, while the man at Duo's side kept his gun out. Duo was torn between sighing in disgust and rolling his eyes. The gun's safety had been on the entire time. Somehow, it seemed to figure that Edward wouldn't have known the difference. The car pulled up in front of the building, and Duo was hauled out from the car. He stumbled on purpose, taking advantage of the momentary delay to look around and get his bearings. The two people in the front seat stayed in the car, and Duo watched out of the corner of his eye as the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the night. There were men and women walking in and out of the building, even this late at night, and they were all dressed in black. Duo smiled to himself. It looked like they'd decided to hold him in a civilian police station, since the military headquarters was probably already nothing more than a pile of smoking rubble. Duo shifted, feeling the last two smoke bombs clink together, and ducked his head to keep from laughing outright as he was hauled past several police officers and into the building. He was brought to a halt in front of a desk, and his escort waited for them to be noticed. The woman looked up, a bored expression on her face. "May I help you?" Her gaze flicked over Duo, and he gave her a cheeky smile. Her expression was severe, but he noticed one side of her mouth quirking, like she was having a little trouble remaining stern. She cleared her throat and looked over his head. "I wasn't aware the military was in the habit of delivering juvenile delinquents."
"He's not... well, he is, but he's of special interest to the military. We need to keep him in one of your holding cells until we can transfer him to Central,"
the man said. The woman shrugged and waved them off in the direction of the hallway behind her desk. The man pushed Duo forward, twisting his arm a bit to send him towards the holding cells. Central, Duo thought, recognizing the city's name. Sloane had told Edward to head back to Central, and Edward's boss was named... Duo racked his brains for the information. Mustang. Something Mustang. Duo pondered sitting tight in a locked cell and letting these guys do all the work getting him to Central. He just as quickly squashed the notion. Sitting around and waiting wasn't quite his style. Not if he had anything to do with it, he added darkly. And it wasn't like anyone was going to show up and get him out either. First, Edward and Alphonse were on their way to Central, and second, Hero wasn't even in this world. On the upside, that did reduce his chances of getting shot by any rescuer, so that was a plus. Duo was shoved through the double doors and down a long hallway. He caught quick glimpses of the locks on the holding cells as they walked past, and he had to duck his head to hide a smirk. Actually, he decided, getting out of this place might end up downright boring if the locks were that simple.
"Hey, boy!"
The call came from somewhere nearby, and Duo was brought up short as the officers started at the sound. The shout came again, and Duo turned to see the man, one of the two from the doctor's basement, heading down the road towards them. Hecht's face was lit up in recognition, but he frowned as he came closer, realizing Duo's hands were cuffed. At the last minute, the policeman's face was smoothed into blandness.
"Oh, sorry. I thought you had my nephew there." "I doubt it,"
the officer replied.
"We're using your facilities to house him overnight, before we can send him to Central." "Yeah,"
Hecht replied, nodding thoughtfully.
"Heard there was a big ruckus over at the military headquarters. Some kind of explosions. Vandalism,"
the man replied, and pointed to the empty cell at the end of the block.
"Do you have the keys?" "Oh, sure,"
Hecht said. He fished keys out of his pocket and opened the door. Duo was shoved inside, and he turned immediately, planting his feet belligerently, even as his fingers began working furiously on the cuffs. Hecht winked at him, then turned to the officer.
Say, how long is he going to be here? If you're going to come get him past 9 in the morning, I'll put him on the list for breakfast. He won't need breakfast,
the officer said curtly.
Just make sure he's left in there alone. We don't want anyone else endangered because they're left in the same cell with him. He may look helpless, but he's not.
With that, the officer turned and stalked off, obviously having enough of escorting a kid around. Duo watched him go without much regret. Hecht remained where he was, though, a contemplative look on his face.
Hey, kid,
Hecht called, very softly.
You okay? You seem to turn up in the strangest places. Yeah,
Duo replied, grinning. He brought one hand up from behind his back, raising it behind his head to scratch an itch under his braid.
But it's okay. I'll be fine. You'll be...
Hecht's eyes went wide, and his gaze fell from Duo's raised arm to the other, where cuffs were still dangling from Duo's wrist. Hecht chuckled softly.
Yeah, I guess you will. Where you gonna go, kid? The military has this city covered. Especially with the town going a little crazy after finding out about the lieutenant colonel's plans to set us up for another war.
I need to go to Central, Duo told him, pitching his voice low. He tugged the cuffs off his other wrist and handed them through the bars to Hecht. Duo flexed his hands and rubbed at the scrapes from the cuffs, even though he'd nearly dislocated his thumbs to work free. Another quick ring, and his thumbs popped back into joint. Duo glanced at Hecht, waiting.
There's a 3:30 train in about 15 minutes.
Hecht said.
I don't know if you can make it. Got any ideas for getting there fast?
Duo glanced casually up and down the hallway. There were double doors at the near end by his cell, another set at the far end. 2 police officers were standing at the far end of the hallway by the doors, chatting. Probably the guards, Duo thought.
It's on my way home, and my shift was over a few minutes ago.
Hecht admitted with a wry grin.
But I saw you, and wondered why you were here without the National Alchemist. They sent him home, and I need to catch up with him,
Duo said. He pulled his braid around, fishing in his hair for his lockpicks.
Where's your car? In the back.
Hecht poked the cuffs, just as the 2 guards turned away to speak with another police officer. He lowered his voice, looking off down the hallway, as though just pausing for thought before heading off.
When you go out the back door, look to the left. There's a low line of bushes, and I'll be at the end, parked next to them, with the engine running.
He grinned.
Don't know why I'm doing this, but you're not a normal kid, are you? I could have sworn you couldn't speak a word of our language when I first saw you. No, I couldn't,
came the confession. Duo poked the lockpick into the side of the lock and fiddled with it. It clicked, and Duo grinned.
Go on. And thank you. Wait for 3 minutes,
the policeman said.
I'll think of something to distract them up front. Use these,
Duo said, holding out the bottles.
Light this bit and throw. Smoke.
Hecht palmed the bottles from Duo and stared at them for a second, then laughed, long and low.
You know, I never did like the military, and I sure as hell don't like it when they try to do my job for me. And I sure as hell don't like it when they risk my family, or come up with a scheme that could get my sons killed, just because some bastard wants a promotion. I don't know what you are, but I don't see any reason to make you a dog of the military against your will. No one deserves that fate.
Hecht tucked the bottles into his jacket and strolled off, whistling. Duo watched him go and stayed by the door, holding it shut as he waited. He'd counted to 120 under his breath when the first shouts came. Another 90 heartbeats passed, and more shouts came from somewhere outside the building. It wasn't until those second shouts echoed through that the policeman by the front door took off. Duo grinned, opening the cell door. A quick glance around, and he bolted for the back door. It was locked, but a few twiddles from the lockpicks, and the door swung open. Down another hallway, and Duo ducked behind a plant stand as more police officers went running past. Almost laughing out loud at the simplicity, Duo headed towards a door that looked suitably thick to be an outside door. Kicking it open, he found himself in the back parking lot. There, along the bushes at the end, was a car. Its running lights were on. Duo slunk down behind the bushes, running almost on hands and knees, hunkered down until he got to the car. Opening the door just a little, he slipped inside. It wasn't until he pulled the door shut that the driver sat up with a start.
"That you, boy?"
Hecht asked the question, barely moving his mouth.
"Yeah,"
Duo whispered.
"There's a blanket. Pull it over you and stay down. The front street is swarming with police and military."
Hecht pulled the car away from its parking space, and Duo listened as the car slowed down, rolling to a stop. The blanket muffled the sounds, but from what Duo could tell, Hecht was asking about injuries to his co-workers. A few more friendly words were exchanged, and Hecht shouted a good night as he pulled away. Several minutes passed, the car speeding up and slowing down as it turned corners and came to stops at intersections.
"All right, boy,"
Hecht said.
"We're at the train station. I think you have about 5 minutes before the next train. You going to be able to make it from here?" "Yeah,"
Duo said, slipping from the car. He paused, long enough to flash a grin over his face.
"Thank you again. I can't repay you. Just don't let the bastards use you for their purposes, boy,"
Hecht whispered.
"I won't,"
Duo replied, and was off, running across the side lawn leaning up to the train station. "I won't," he promised. "In this world, or any other." Duo stayed in the shadows, waiting anxiously for the train. He wasn't willing to step out and see if Edward and Alphonse were there, and risk being seen himself. So he kept to the far end of the platform. When the train whistle sounded from across the distance, Duo tensed, his mind going into overdrive as he began considering the different ways to sneak onto the train. He'd snuck into shuttles and ships, and one colony cruiser in his lifetime, but a train was going to be a new experience. As the train neared the station, Duo could only shake his head and grin at his luck. It's not just any train, he thought. It's a goddamn steam engine. Which meant the undercarriage would probably be exposed, if he recalled G's rambling about the developments of transportation. The old man had liked to go on about where he'd gotten some of his ideas for Death Scythe, and they seemed to come from the oddest places. Unfortunately, Duo wasn't sure about much more than the fact that steam was produced from some kind of combustion, and it drove the wheels. That was pretty rudimentary, since all moving vehicles operated under the same premise. An engine of some sort either pushed or pulled the vehicle. Duo groaned as the train pulled into the station. The undercarriage was completely exposed. It was going to be a long, cold ride, he thought. And if this isn't the right train, I'm going to shoot someone. Possibly myself. He perked up when he heard the conductor yelling that the train was bound for Central, with some number of stops between that Duo didn't catch. He was too busy darting out behind the conductor and slipping under the last section of the train. Tucking his braid down the back of his coat, Duo buttoned up the coat and weaseled up under the train's belly. He kept going until he was on his back, his chest pressed to the wooden undercarriage and his cheek flat against the wood. Duo wriggled experimentally, making sure there was no moving parts nearby and that he wouldn't slip accidentally. Now he just needed to stay awake and not freeze to death. By the third stop, Duo had taken to chanting weapon statistics at the top of his lungs to keep himself awake. During the first stop, he'd managed to rearrange himself so his coat collar was pulled up over his head, but it left his ankles and feet exposed. There was no comfortable way to curl up, not with 4 bands of steel running behind his body, making his hips sink while his back was curved from the bar across the base of his spine. At least he'd managed to find ways to grab hold of 2 more bars with his arms, locking his hands together in case his shoulders slipped off the first bar. Duo kept his face pressed to the wood, listening to the conductor announce the station's names, followed by Central as the final destination. Once the train started going again, Duo was back to shouting. This time, it was a listing of his kill rate of mobile dolls, broken down by types, compared to Wing and Heavy Arms. He was pleased to discover he was in the lead. 2 more stops came and went, and Duo couldn't feel his legs from the knees down. He gritted his teeth, his throat sore, and tried desperately not to think of hot coffee, warm baths, and big, fluffy blankets. It didn't help that he was certain he was coated in grime, between the soot from the engine and the dirt from the tracks underneath. At least his braid was tucked up inside his coat, he thought. One less thing to wash, even if the rest of him would need to be dipped in bleach and wrung out thoroughly. Warm bleach, preferably. When the train pulled into Central, the sun was just beginning to rise, and Duo had to claw his way out from under the train. He fell to the tracks with a solid thump, and lay there for a second, trying to get his breath. His legs were completely numb, and he rolled around on the tracks between the wheels, hoping he had enough time to get from under the train before it moved again. Dragging himself by his elbows, he struggled to clench and unclench his hands, cursing the lack of feeling. His face was numb as well, which he didn't realize until his elbows gave way and he went face first into the train bed's gravel. Dully he forced himself back up again, and thanked whatever powers that existed in this world that no one seemed to notice a dark shape crawling out from under the last train car. He rested for a split second once he was out from under the train, then hoisted himself up onto the platform. He twisted as he moved until he was perched on the edge. Duo smacked his hands against the concrete and winced as feeling started to return. Maybe I should have let the military bring me to Central, he thought bleakly. I feel even worse than if Oz had worked me over.
Hey, kid!
Someone yelled.
You can't sit there!
Duo looked up to see a conductor heading towards him, and he grinned, hoping he looked suitably young. The conductor waved his arms as he approached, obviously angry.
Go on, get out of here! Yeah,
Duo muttered, clambering unsteadily to his feet. He swayed, but didn't fall, if only through sheer willpower.
Military headquarters,
he croaked as the conductor came closer.
Where? Like they'd have anything to do with a street rat like you,
the conductor muttered.
Get out of my station. I won't have any pickpockets around. This place isn't for the likes of you.
Duo shrugged and barely managed to turn around, following the streams of people on the off chance they were heading for the exit. He stumbled a little, but caught himself, keeping his head down and his hands in his pockets. He wasn't entirely sure what the conductor had said, but the tone of voice was one he recognized enough from his childhood. He figured it was probably the same thing on any world. You're a kid who's up to no good, stealing and panhandling. Get out of here before I call the cops. Whatever, Duo thought, and raised one numb hand to swipe at his face. He couldn't see a sign of Alphonse or Edward anywhere, and sighed. A 6-foot-tall suit of armor shouldn't be that hard to find, even in the early morning crowd of commuters. Someone bumped into him and he nearly fell, but caught himself against the wall. He pushed forward, leaning against the wall for balance, and after several minutes made it to the door. Taking a careful step away from the wall, Duo threw himself into the press of bodies and let them carry him along. A few seconds later he was out the door and had 2 wallets in his pocket. He wasn't sure what the money was like here, but he'd seen the money Alphonse had used to pay for the pastries. Paper and some metal coins. Duo hoped the wallets were full, and tottered away from the doors quickly. With his fingers still mostly numb, he was sure his technique had to be clumsy, and his shoulders tensed, waiting for someone to start yelling. When no one did, he looked around for something that looked like a taxi. They better have taxis, he thought. What kind of civilized world wouldn't have taxis? There were several cars that looked like Hects, parked along the curve. They had signs on their roofs, and Duo grabbed the first one, crossing his fingers that his guess was right. He had to scrabble with his hands to get the back door open, and threw himself into the back seat. "Military headquarters," he said, and coughed. The driver turned around, giving him a bored look, rapidly replaced by a wide-eyed stare. Duo grinned wryly, figuring he wasn't the cleanest passenger the driver had ever had. Duo coughed again to clear his throat, and dug out the wad of money from the first wallet. "Please, military headquarters. Go fast."
Sure, kid,"
the driver said, then paused.
"You didn't steal this, did you?"
Great, Duo thought, figuring out the word by context. How did he get around that one? Thinking fast, he put on a sorrowful face.
"It's all I have left,"
he explained. The driver stared at the money, then Duo, and took it, nodding.
"Okay, direct to military headquarters. Which one?" "Which one?" Duo blinked. Alchemists,"
he said, his voice hoarse.
"National Alchemists, Mustang." "Don't know the name, but I know the Alchemist headquarters. Other side of town, in the North Annex,"
the driver replied. He pulled away from the curb, and Duo looked back over his shoulder to see two people by the train station door, shouting and waving their arms. Duo slunk down in the seat and basked in the warmth of the taxi's heater system. 15 minutes later, the taxi pulled up in front of a large building. Duo's shoulders slumped at the wide open space between the gate and the front of the building. It was a long way to cross, with no cover, and his instincts were on full alert. He distantly realized the driver was holding out change, and he shook his head.
"Keep it,"
Duo said, and carefully got out of the taxi. Shutting the door behind him, he took a wobbly step forward, getting his balance. Every step sent pins and needles up his legs as feeling returned, but his feet were still mostly numb. Walking through the gate, Duo let his shoulders relax into a slouch and tucked his hands in his pockets, ducking his chin beneath the coat's collar. Nonchalant, he told himself. Walk like you belong here. Yeah, he added, if you can walk at all. It'll be kind of obvious if you fall on your face. It took 217 paces. Duo counted every single one to get to the bottom steps. He took a deep breath and forced his knees to bend, staggering up the steps only by keeping the forward momentum. At the top, 2 people in blue military uniforms were leaving, and Duo slipped past them as though he belonged there. Neither seemed to notice, and he sighed as he entered the building. The main lobby was massive, with a huge set of stairs going up one side. There was a guard desk in the middle, and Duo squared his shoulders. Making his way to the desk, he did his best to lean against it surreptitiously. What he really wanted was to sit down and not get up again. Preferably to sit down in a hot bath and not get up again until he was sure his only destination was a big, comfortable bed. Hell, he'd settle for death-sized cockpit, as long as it was someplace safe and warm.
Civilians aren't allowed past this point without escort,
the guard said.
Are you here to see someone? Do you have an appointment?
I figured yes and no, Duo answered, his throat tightening. His brain shuttled through the questions, sorting them and translating without too much conscious effort, which was fine by him. He couldn't see his voice getting above a whisper.
Mustang. Lieutenant Colonel Mustang?
The guard looked skeptical.
You have an appointment? No,
Duo retorted, starting to feel cross.
Just get him. It's about Full Metal. Full Metal?
The guard looked surprised, then frowned. After a second, he nodded and picked up the phone, dialing rapidly.
Second Lieutenant Hawkeye. There's someone at the...
He paused, startled.
No, ma'am. It's some kid. Who says he's here about Full Metal? Yeah, a kid. About 5 feet, I guess, dressed in black.
The guard's voice dropped to a whisper, and he hunched his shoulders, as though to keep Duo from overhearing.
and he's filthy. I mean, just covered in dirt. I see. I'll tell him.
Duo rolled his eyes. His braid wasn't that bad, even if his face probably was darker than it had ever been, even after 2 months on Earth. He scrubbed at his face with his coat sleeve, a bit self-consciously. Maybe it was a bad idea to come find Mustang, since he'd lost Edward and Alphonse, but he couldn't think of a better idea, and it sounded like he was about to be turned away. He had to come up with something to get the man's attention.
Chimera,
Duo said suddenly.
Tell him it's about chimeras. What?
The guard frowned, then spoke into the phone.
Sorry, ma'am. It's about the chimeras. Oh, yes, ma'am.
The guard's agreement sounded forced out of him.
I'll let him know.
The man hung up and gave Duo an irritated look.
Warrant Officer Havoc will be down to escort you,
he said.
And you can wait over there. Yeah, sure,
Duo muttered, taking a deep breath before he pushed away from the desk, heading for the low benches along the wall. The guard had pointed to a spot by the door, but Duo wasn't interested in standing around, and he didn't give a damn if the guard was worried he'd muck up the upholstery. He collapsed into the nearest seat, and suddenly wondered whether now he wouldn't be able to get back up. Yawning, he leaned his elbows on his knees and tried to stay awake. Footfalls snapped him out of a light doze, and he blinked, looking up at a tall man who was bending down to peer at him. Duo blinked again and yawned, pushing off from the sofa with his hands. He was pleased to find most of the feeling had returned to his fingers, and his legs were almost completely back in working order. He stared up at the man, who had an unlit cigarette hanging from between his lips, and was giving Duo a bemused look. The man's blonde hair stood up in a shock, falling lightly over his brow, but his blue uniform was buttoned up and neatly pressed. It made Duo feel even grungier.
Mustang,
Duo managed to croak.
Full metal. Sure thing, kid,
the man said.
I'm Warrant Officer Havoc.
At Duo's puzzled look, the man grinned, revealing even white teeth.
Call me Havoc. Probably easier. You look exhausted. Hell, you look like you got dragged here by wild horses. Got here by train.
Duo muttered, not sure what Havoc had said, but figuring he could guess. When Havoc jerked his head towards the hallway, Duo staggered forward. Havoc caught him under the elbow, and Duo took a deep breath before pulling away.
I'm okay,
he said, coughing a few times.
Need to see Mustang. Right,
Havoc said in a dubious voice.
Follow me then.
It was a long walk down a hallway, then down another one, and up a flight of stairs. Duo kept his hand on the railing and didn't care whether Havoc had chosen the long way to avoid being seen with a filthy street kid. At the top of the stairs, Havoc led the way down another hallway, and then to an imposing wooden door. Havoc rapped it quickly with his knuckles.
Come in,
a voice called. It sounded irritable, and Duo took a steadying breath as Havoc opened the door and saluted sharply.
Lieutenant Colonel Mustang,
Havoc said.
I've brought...
He stopped and turned to Duo.
What's your name, anyway?
Duo Maxwell, Duo said. He smiled faintly, too tired to manage more than that, and turned to blink at the people standing a few feet away. The man's back was to the window, and the early morning sun was in Duo's eyes. He could make out a woman standing next to the man, and she was holding something that appeared to be a stack of files. She turned, and Duo could see her blonde hair was pinned up, making a little flip of a tail at the back of her head. But her eyes were kind, if assessing. She took the file from the man's hand and put it on top of her stack, stepping back. Mustang was silent as he stepped between the light and Duo, revealing he was only a little taller than the woman, with jet black hair that fell down around his face, and sleepy dark eyes. He was also wearing the dark blue uniform, but Duo noticed a few more bars and stripes on the man's shoulder, probably indicating his higher rank. Mustang didn't move closer, however, and one gloved hand was raised, as if he was ready to snap his fingers. Another alchemist, Duo thought immediately. Edward had needed to clap his hands, but this man could just snap his fingers. Duo tensed, and his fingers itched to make sure his gun was closer to hand than the back of his jeans under a buttoned coat.
What do you know about the Full Metal?
The man's voice was low and smooth, but with a hidden tension.
He's not yet returned from Durian. This morning,
Duo replied, unable to get more than a whisper.
On the train. Left city, military people.
He struggled for the word and shrugged, waving his hands a little.
Military building, chimeras, boom.
There was a stifled laugh from behind Duo, and he gave the man in front of him a tired grin.